Okay, so let us look into positivism, right? Positivism as a paradigm started back with Auguste Comte, who was a French theoretician or philosopher, basically, right? He basically developed the idea that, or he emphasized that in the paradigm, when you are using the approach of positivism, the researcher must be able to concentrate on studying observable facts, right? Something that can be observed, right? Something that you can measure, something that you can see, something that you can sense, and so on. It should avoid speculative and metaphysical approaches, something that cannot be tested or experimented. Something doesn't hold factual evidence or numerical evidence, right? That is also what is emphasized as, also known as scientific method quantitative. Basically, positivism plays a huge role in quantitative research. They also emphasize on the usage of empirical science. And empirical, basically going after the data, right? The more the data, the more concrete. The more the data is believed that it is more concrete, right? So that's how Comte has defined about positivism. Right, its emphasis on relation between causes and effects, experimental research objectively controlled forms, right? The researcher must be able to identify the cause and effects to certain phenomena, to certain behavior, to certain issues and so on, circumstances and so on and so forth, right? It has to be objective, which means you are not allowing for subjective interpretation, right? In which knowledge generated by careful observation and measurement of objective reality. Which means if let's say that there's increase in number of Facebook users, so you want to research why there's an increase in number of Facebook users in this last 1 month, and then you'll find that the isolation period, the quarantine period, and so on, that has played a role, right? It's very objective. The subjective condition that has contributed. That's how positivism makes its research, right? Another important figure in positivism is basically Immanuel Durkheim. Right. He says that social facts exist outside individual awareness and rather in collective representation, right? Right. It is a characteristic of natural sciences. Right. Social facts, the conditions around an individual is that it is what that influence an individual, right, in a society, performing character in society and so on. Right, Bryman has summarized several assumptions on positivism, right? According to him, only phenomena confirmed by the senses can be warranted as knowledge, right? If it is not confirmed, cannot be assessed through your senses, then it cannot be regarded as a knowledge, right? Theories used to generate hypotheses that can be tested and allow explanations of groups to be assessed, which is also what we call as deductivism, right? You have a theory that says, let's say the theory says that the number of students accessing to digital library, because it's free of charge, something that can be tested. Then whether you want to test whether the free of charge has allowed for students to access to library much more frequent compared to a charged a library that has to be paid and so on, right? So you deduct from a theory, then you develop an hypothesis, then you test the hypothesis whether this complements to that. whether this cause to that effect. And so knowledge can be produced by collecting facts that provide the basis for a law. Right? So you build from zero to you induce, or what we call it, inductivism, and you have certain knowledge or certain idea, then you develop it, and then from there you make your own conclusions. And so science must and can be conducted in a way that is value free and thus objective, right? It's basically positivism goes for objectivity, like as we spoken before. Clear distinction between scientific and normative statements, right? Basically, what it means is that social research have to be accessible by the senses, where theories are the starting points from which hypotheses are deduced and which shall be tested, right? The research starts from the facts that can be collected and from which it can be inductively derived. Research is basically oriented on the ideal of objectivity, which also means it should be independent of the person, of the individual researcher, and free of value. Right? The role of researcher is very limited, which means you don't give your subjective interpretation to the circumstances and so on. Right? As the aim of positivism is to achieve or is to make scientific statements, it should refrain from normative and evaluative statements. Right? That's what we derive or deduce about positive. Right? Positivism, what we call as, it's often associated with realism, right? Which means it assumes that the natural and social sciences should and can apply the same principles to collecting and analyzing data. And it also postulates there's a world out there, and external reality separate from our what we call descriptions of it. Right? There's an external reality, a reality that is not how do you define it? That is not in control of the individuals, right? This means that basically we should try to collect facts in and about the world, and that this is possible. Right? For example, a collection of attitudes towards a political party can be based on the assumption that the attitude can be seen as a fact and thus be measured, right? Okay. Now we'll look into constructionism, right? It became a contender view of sociology, right? Sociology, the early 20th century. Just like any research, even world paradigms and worldview paradigms, right? It comes as a response to the previous views or findings and so on, right? Because there are sometimes there are significant gaps or that has not been addressed by certain views, right? There's something lacking, right? So you come up, you improvise with something else, right? So that's how constructionism comes into the foray, right? So it basically examines the relationship to reality by using constructive process to approach it. Right? Constructionism is not a unified program but develops in number of disciplines. I will look into it. What does that mean, right? Individuals seen as a developing subjective meaning of their experiences rather than being directly stimulated by external, right? This basically emphasizes that individuals are made up of subjectively. They have the capacity to subjectively interpret or understand their experiences. Which also puts the researcher to include the subjective interpretation, right? The researcher looks for complexity of meanings rather than narrowing down meanings in few categories. Like for positivism or quantitative studies, we have very few categories, right? We try to categorize we try to put it in few limited themes. But in subjective interpretation, or like in constructionism, we try to develop the meanings. What, like for instance, right, what about the poor people who are flouting the MCO, for instance? Why they are not staying at home during MCO period? Like, are they disobedient, or are there any other external reality, right? They are their own reality, right? What is the socio-economic condition? They don't have, their houses are not as big as the rich people for them to spend their time in houses and so on. Like, this is what we call as constructionism, right? Construct theory from observations of meaning construction by social actors, right? Social actors, interactions and situation, how you construct your meanings from interaction with these people and so on, right? It's constructed from human experience as opposed to discovered self-evident knowledge, right? It is basically a step-by-step process where the human experience involves greatly to construct, to establish certain behaviors and so on. Right? Social constructionism, right, in the tradition, like what Schutz and Berger and Lockman has said, the social or cultural or historical, for instance, right, there are many other aspects, can influence perceptions and knowledge in everyday life, right? Your social conditions, your cultural backgrounds, your historical backgrounds, where were you brought, in what culture, what faith, this all has an influence over your perception and knowledge in everyday life, right? All our knowledge of the world in common sense as well as in scientific thinking involves construct, right? It's a set of abstraction, generalization, formalizations, and idealization. It is not something that comes innate, right? It's not something that drop out of the sky, right? Drop from the sky, and so we don't treat knowledge in that sense. There is something that's constructed from your interaction with your parents, your interaction with your teachers, your interaction with the society, someone that you have met, and so on. This is how meanings are constructed. The things that you read, and so on, right? This is all. These are all holds value in molding your perceptions. So it's typically associated with qualitative methods and literary and informal rhetoric, in which the researcher relies as much as possible on the participant's view until the subjective meaning of the phenomenon. And as we have discussed earlier, right, how the participants, which mean your respondents or the people who are you're studying about, right, how they view and develop meanings of the phenomenon. So in this situation, like in this kind of research, you let your participant to come up to give you the answers, the data. It might be different from one to another, right? And another thing is that the research is shaped from bottom up, which individual perspective to broad patterns and ultimately. So you start from a very narrow perspective, or from a narrow objective, and then you develop it to be more broad for generalization, right? That's how constructive this research is shaped. Researchers look for complexity of meanings rather than narrowing down meanings in few categories, right? You try to develop it to be broader in the sense that it gives more meaning, it gives more explanations rather than very few explanations on descriptive kind of explanations, right? This happens, and so this is something that's more subjective. It gives very different, a broader interpretation to what's happening. Right? Every form of knowledge is constructed by selection and structuring. How you select certain information, the information that's how do participants treat information that are not that are not aligned to their views, right? So how do they react to that? How do they react to some views that complement to their ideas, right? So what are the differences?